Everyone thinks they already know the Epstein story until they actually look at the documents. Because the biggest shock isn't just what happened, it's how many powerful names appeared in connection with him in completely different ways. Some were social acquaintances, some business contacts, some critics, some investigators, and some simply people whose names showed up in flight logs, calendars, or testimony without any proven wrongdoing. And that distinction is exactly where most public confusion begins. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just another wealthy financier living quietly behind closed doors. He built a network that stretched into politics, business, academia, tech, royalty, and entertainment. He cultivated influence carefully, hosting dinners, funding research, offering introductions, and presenting himself as someone who could connect ambitious people with opportunity. That image opened doors, and once those doors opened, his social circle grew unusually powerful. When the legal cases against him began surfacing publicly, especially after his 2019 arrest and subsequent death in jail, attention shifted fast from his crimes to his connections. People wanted answers: who knew him, who visited him, who traveled with him, and who might have enabled him. But here's where reality gets messy. Being mentioned in documents isn't the same as being implicated in wrongdoing. And yet, in the public conversation, those lines often blur. Donald Trump is one of the names frequently discussed. Public records show they knew each other socially in the 1990s when Epstein was active in elite New York and Florida circles. Trump himself later said they had a falling out years before Epstein's major legal troubles became widely known. There are also documented statements with Epstein as someone who been moral ego after an incident involving a staff member, a claim reported in multiple journalistic investigations. Importantly, no charges were brought against Trump related to Epstein, but the association remains part of the historical record because their social overlap was real. Bill Gates is another figure whose connection drew intense attention, particularly because of his post-Microsoft philanthropic leadership. Reports confirmed Gates met Epstein multiple times after Epstein's earlier conviction became public knowledge. Gates later acknowledged those meetings were a mistake, saying he regretted ever spending time with him. According to investigations by major newspapers, the meetings were often framed around philanthropy and funding discussions, but they sparked criticism because many believed Epstein should have been socially isolated after his conviction. Then there's Prince Andrew, whose connection became one of the most legally significant. His friendship with Epstein was documented extensively, and allegations from Virginia GFR led to a civil case that was eventually settled out of court. Prince Andrew denied the allegations but stepped back from public royal duties amid intense scrutiny. This case showed how Epstein's relationships could escalate from social acquaintance to serious legal consequences depending on the evidence presented. And yet, many other names appear in Epstein-related documents simply because they attended events, were listed in contact books, or appeared in flight logs. Being on a flight log, for example, might mean someone took a single trip for business or social reasons, not that they were aware of or involved in criminal activity. Legal experts constantly emphasize this nuance, but public discussions often ignore it. Flight logs themselves became a major focal point. Epstein owned private jets sometimes referred to in media as the Lolita Express, and passenger manifests from those flights were released in court proceedings. These logs included politicians, celebrities, academics, and business leaders. Some passengers have publicly clarified why they flew with him, others have stayed silent. Again, inclusion in a log isn't evidence of wrongdoing, but it fueled speculation because secrecy had surrounded Epstein for so long. Another piece of the puzzle comes from Epstein's infamous contact book, sometimes called the Black Book. It contained hundreds of names, numbers, and addresses. Journalists who examined it stressed that a contact entry doesn't equal friendship or involvement. High-profile individuals often exchange contact information casually at events, conferences, or introductions without deeper relationships forming. Court depositions added even more complexity. Witness testimony can include references to people who never committed crimes but were simply present in certain environments. Courts treat such mentions carefully, distinguishing allegation from evidence. Public discourse, however, often collapses those categories into a single narrative of suspicion. Part of why this story retains such powerful public fascination is the perception that wealth and influence may have shielded Epstein for years. His 2008 plea deal in Florida, widely criticized as unusually lenient, intensified suspicions that connections mattered. Later investigations by journalists helped reopen scrutiny, ultimately leading to his 2019 federal charges. When Epstein died in custody, officially ruled a suicide, another wave of speculation erupted. Questions about jail procedures, surveillance failures, and institutional accountability fed conspiracy theories. Regardless of those theories, multiple official investigations found procedural failures but no confirmed homicide. Still, the perception of unfinished justice keeps interest alive. And that's where the names Trump, Gates, Clinton, Andrew, celebrities, CEOs, academics continue resurfacing. Not because every mention implies guilt, but because Epstein deliberately positioned himself among influential people. Proximity to power was part of how he maintained credibility. Bill Clinton, for example, appeared in some flight logs, acknowledged several trips related to humanitarian work years ago, while repeatedly stating he knew nothing about Epstein's criminal conduct. Clinton has never been charged with wrongdoing connected to Epstein, yet his association remains a recurring topic because of his global prominence. Similarly, many tech leaders, financiers, and scholars interacted with Epstein during the period when he presented himself as a science philanthropist. Some universities accepted donations that were later returned once the full scope of his crimes became clearer. Those academic links show how reputational influence can mask underlying misconduct. Understanding the Epstein files requires separating three categories: documented criminal evidence, social association, and speculative interpretation. Criminal evidence includes court-proven acts and legal settlements. Social association includes documented meetings, events, or travel without evidence of wrongdoing. Speculation is everything else, often driven by incomplete information. The challenge is that the internet rarely respects those boundaries. Viral posts tend to flatten nuance. A single photo at a party can circulate stripped of context. A name in a document becomes a headline implying guilt. That distortion fuels both outrage and misinformation. Media coverage itself evolved over time. Early reporting in the 2000s focused narrowly on legal proceedings. Later, investigative journalism expanded to systemic questions about wealth, influence, and institutional accountability. After 2019, coverage shifted again toward document releases, survivor testimony, and the broader social network. For survivors, this attention has been double-edged. On one hand, exposure helped validate their experiences and push legal accountability. On the other, intense focus on famous names sometimes overshadowed the victims themselves. Many advocates argue the central story should always remain the abuse and its impact, not just who knew whom. Another factor often overlooked is how elite social circles function. Wealthy individuals frequently attend the same fundraisers, conferences, and private gatherings. Networking in such spaces doesn't always involve deep personal knowledge. That reality complicates attempts to interpret every connection as meaningful. Legal analysts repeatedly stress that guilt requires evidence, not proximity. Courts rely on documentation, testimony, corroboration, and due process. Public opinion, by contrast, often operates on association alone. That gap explains why discussions around Epstein's contacts remain emotionally charged. There's also a psychological element. People are drawn to narratives where hidden networks explain complex problems. The Epstein case, involving secrecy, power, and crime, fits that pattern perfectly. It becomes a canvas onto which broader distrust of elites gets projected. At the same time, legitimate questions about accountability persist. How did Epstein maintain influence after his earlier conviction? Why did some institutions continue interacting with him? Could stronger safeguards have prevented further harm? Those questions remain important regardless of which names appear in documents. Transparency has increased over the years. Court releases, journalistic investigations, and survivor advocacy have gradually filled gaps. But complete clarity may never emerge. Some records remain sealed for privacy reasons, others lost, and memories fade over time. And perhaps that unresolved aspect is why interest never fades. Every document release sparks renewed analysis. Every public figure mentioned faces scrutiny again. Each new detail gets interpreted through existing beliefs about power and justice. So when you hear names like Trump, Gates, Clinton, or others linked to Epstein, the critical question isn't just were they mentioned, it's in what context. Social contact, business meeting, philanthropic discussion, flight log entry, allegation, or proven legal finding. Those distinctions matter enormously. Without that context, it's easy to create narratives that feel convincing but lack factual grounding. With context, the story becomes less sensational but more accurate. A criminal who embedded himself in influential networks, some knowingly close, others distantly connected, and a society still grappling with how that was possible. The Epstein files, ultimately, aren't a single explosive revelation. They're a mosaic of legal documents, testimony, social records, and investigative reporting. Some pieces confirm wrongdoing, others simply map a social world that intersected with his life. And the hardest truth may be this: power structures are complicated. Influence doesn't always operate through obvious channels. Accountability can lag behind exposure, and public understanding often evolves slowly, shaped by evidence, media framing, and collective perception. What remains essential is critical thinking. Distinguish evidence from rumor, understand the difference between association and accusation, and remember that behind every headline are real victims whose experiences deserve more attention than the celebrity names that dominate discussion. Because if there's one lasting lesson from the Epstein case, it's not just about who appeared in documents. It's about how societies handle power, secrecy, accountability, and justice, and how easily narratives can shift when information is incomplete. And that conversation isn't over. It probably won't be for a long time. And what makes this story even more complicated is how memory, reputation, and timing collide. Some people met Epstein before his 2008 conviction, when his public image was still largely that of a wealthy financier with elite connections. Others interacted with him afterward, which drew heavier criticism because by then his legal history was widely known. That timeline difference often gets lost when discussions happen online, yet it changes how those relationships are perceived. There's also the question of how Epstein managed impressions so effectively. Former associates and journalists have described him as someone who studied influence carefully. He donated to scientific research, attended high-level conferences, funded academic projects, and surrounded himself with respected professionals. That created a kind of credibility shield, a perception that someone accepted in prestigious circles must be legitimate. History has shown repeatedly that this assumption can be dangerously wrong. Some observers point to what they call reputation laundering, where association with respected institutions softens public scrutiny. Epstein's involvement with universities, think tanks, and philanthropic initiatives gave him access to conversations far beyond finance. Even after controversies surfaced, those earlier associations sometimes delayed full reputational collapse. At the same time, many institutions later acknowledged mistakes. Universities returned donations, organizations tightened vetting processes, and individuals publicly distanced themselves. Those responses reflect how public accountability often unfolds in stages rather than instantly. Another aspect rarely discussed enough is media evolution. 2 decades ago, information traveled slower. Allegations might stay confined to courtrooms or local reporting. Today, digital platforms amplify every document released within minutes. That acceleration changes how scandals unfold, sometimes improving transparency, sometimes amplifying misinformation. And misinformation has played a significant role in the Epstein narrative. Edited images, misattributed quotes, fabricated flight log entries, and conspiracy theories circulate constantly. Fact-checkers repeatedly debunk false claims, yet corrections rarely travel as far as the original viral content. That imbalance shapes public perception more than many realize. Psychologists studying rumor spreads say uncertainty fuels speculation. When a high-profile case ends without full closure, as many feel happened after Epstein's death, people search for alternative explanations. Some of those questions are reasonable, others drift into unfounded territory. Distinguishing between the two requires patience and evidence, which social media environments don't always encourage. Legal complexity adds another layer. Civil cases, criminal prosecutions, sealed records, plea agreements, and confidentiality clauses create a patchwork of accessible information. Even experienced journalists sometimes struggle to interpret what documents actually prove versus what they merely reference. For instance, a deposition may include a witness mentioning someone because they were present at an event, not because they committed wrongdoing. Courts allow broad questioning to establish context, but the public often interprets any mention as implication. That misunderstanding can permanently affect reputations even without legal findings. Survivor testimony has been central to pushing this story forward. Without persistent advocacy from victims and investigative journalists, many details might never have reached public awareness. Their willingness to speak, often at personal cost, shifted the narrative from rumor to documented legal action. Yet survivors themselves have repeatedly emphasized that the focus on famous names sometimes distracts from systemic issues: how abuse networks operate, how institutions respond, and how victims can access justice. Those structural questions remain relevant far beyond this single case. Financial power also plays a role worth examining. Wealth can fund legal defense, public relations strategies, and social access. That doesn't guarantee immunity from consequences, but it can shape timelines and visibility. Epstein's case prompted renewed discussion about whether legal systems treat powerful defendants differently. There's historical precedent for these concerns. From corporate scandals to political corruption cases, investigations involving influential figures often move slower and attract intense scrutiny. Transparency helps, but it doesn't eliminate public skepticism. Another overlooked dimension is how elite social networks overlap internationally. Epstein wasn't confined to one country or industry. His contacts span American politics, British royalty, European finance, Middle Eastern investment circles, academic institutions worldwide, and tech philanthropy hubs. That global reach complicated jurisdictional investigations. When documents began surfacing from lawsuits in multiple countries, interpretations varied widely. Legal standards differ, media cultures differ, and public expectations differ. What counts as significant evidence in one legal system may carry different weight in another. Technology also changed the evidence landscape. Emails, digital calendars, flight tracking data, surveillance systems, all these tools created records investigators could analyze. At the same time, privacy laws and data retention limits meant some information was inaccessible or already gone. Another factor sustaining public interest is the broader conversation about power accountability that intensified in recent years. Movements addressing workplace harassment, institutional transparency, and abuse of authority created a cultural backdrop where the Epstein case became symbolic of larger issues. That symbolic weight explains why every new mention, whether involving Trump, Gates, Clinton, Prince Andrew, or lesser-known figures, reignites debate. People aren't just reacting to one individual case, they're reacting to what it represents about privilege and justice. There's also a cautionary lesson about critical consumption of information. Headlines are designed to capture attention, not always to convey nuance. A headline stating someone's name appears in documents can generate clicks without clarifying context. Readers who don't examine full reports may leave with misleading impressions. Investigative journalists themselves often stress reading primary sources when possible. Court documents, verified transcripts, official statements, these provide more reliable context than viral summaries. But they're longer, denser, and less emotionally charged, which makes them less widely shared. Even language matters. Words like linked, connected, or named can imply wrongdoing without stating it directly. Understanding journalistic phrasing helps avoid misinterpretation. Legal reporting especially relies on precise wording because reputations and lawsuits hinge on accuracy. Another angle rarely highlighted is how quickly public alliances shift after scandal exposure. Individuals who once socialized openly may later emphasize distance. Some genuinely had limited interaction, others reassess past relationships in light of new information. Memory itself can be influenced by evolving public narratives. Historians studying past scandals note similar patterns. Initial disbelief, gradual evidence accumulation, reputational distancing, institutional reform attempts, and long-term cultural impact. These stages repeat across decades. There's also the economic dimension of media attention. High-profile cases drive readership, advertising revenue, documentary production, book deals, and streaming content. That financial incentive can prolong coverage even when new factual developments are limited. Documentary series about Epstein, for example, have varied widely in tone. Some focus on survivors and systemic issues, others emphasize celebrity connections. Audience preferences shape which narratives gain prominence. And then there's the question many still ask quietly, could something similar happen again? Experts in criminology and organizational behavior say prevention depends on transparency, accountability structures, and willingness to challenge powerful individuals early rather than after damage accumulates. Whistleblower protections, institutional oversight, investigative journalism, funding, and survivor support networks all contribute to that prevention framework. None are perfect, but each reduces the likelihood of prolonged hidden misconduct. Education plays a role too. Understanding grooming tactics, power dynamics, and consent issues helps communities recognize warning signs sooner. Many advocacy groups emerged stronger after the Epstein case precisely to promote that awareness. Yet despite all these lessons, human psychology doesn't change overnight. Charisma, wealth, perceived success, these still influence trust judgments. That's why critical thinking remains essential, especially when dealing with influential figures. And perhaps the most enduring takeaway is discomfort with ambiguity. People prefer clear heroes and villains. Reality often delivers something messier. A criminal at the center, a spectrum of associations around him, some culpable, some unaware, some negligent, some simply socially adjacent. Accepting that complexity doesn't weaken accountability, it strengthens it, because accurate accountability depends on evidence, not assumption. So the conversation keeps evolving. New documents occasionally surface. Journalists revisit timelines. Survivors continue advocacy. Public figures clarify past interactions. Institutions refine policies. And the broader cultural debate about power, justice, and transparency continues. In the end, understanding the Epstein files isn't about chasing sensationalism. It's about examining how influence operates, how institutions respond to allegations, how media shapes perception, and how societies balance skepticism with fairness. And that balance, between questioning power and respecting evidence, might be the most important lesson still unfolding.